This is Griff Ruby, the Nostalgia Catholic, with yet another Isaac Asimov short story review. This one appears in the October 1956 issue of Fantastic Universe. So let's take a look. It does have his name on the cover. Outstanding fantasy and science fiction stories. Science fiction by Isaac Asimov, William Kent, Robert Bloch, Raymond Jones. However, the feature story is The Pacifist by Arthur C. Clarke. Given what I know of Arthur C. Clarke's writing, it doesn't seem terribly likely this cover would apply to that, but at any rate, clearly it does not apply to Isaac Asimov's story either. So, what do we actually have of it? Well, table of contents lists what it is, and it is a short little story called First Law by Isaac Asimov on page 29. So, what happens on page 29? Let's see what we've got here. No artwork. No artwork. None at all. Okay. There is a couple of short blurbs. This is First Law by Isaac Asimov. A bigger shadow loomed over me suddenly, ... And then we have another blurb to introduce the author. Isaac Asimov, first citizen of science fiction and professor emeritus of robotics, describes the one time when a robot in a not-too-distant future may perhaps violate the first law. A robot may not injure a human being or, through inaction, allow a human being to come to harm. ... And, well, this is an unusual robot story. It is obviously not included in the iRobot. Instead, and it's even more unusual in another respect, this is a very old story of his. You have to go clear back to the time, well, this is when he was getting a lot of stuff in almost every issue of Astounding Science Fiction, late 1941, early 1942, where barely an issue went by without something by Isaac Asimov. And you may remember one of the very much lesser works from that period, known as Time Pussy, one of the two short stories published under a pseudonym, George E. Dale. Okay, but it's Isaac Asimov. John Campbell had asked for him to write a sample of a so-called probability zero. So far, so good. So Asimov sits down and writes one. It doesn't go over. There was one titled Big Game. And some years later, when compiling the early Asimov, he couldn't find it and concluded that it must be lost. As it turns out, the story itself, as originally typed up by Isaac Asimov and just stashed, buried really, among all his numerous papers, had been found by some investigator going through all of that stuff in detail at Boston University, where everything he's ever done is kept, and they managed to find it. And it saw print for the first time in the mid-1970s, his Big Game. I won't be covering that or revisiting that story again, since it is, in fact, nothing more than an earlier draft of another story that comes out in the early 1950s, 50 or 51, titled Day of the Hunters. And it pertains to the people going back to the time of the dinosaurs and discovering that they hunted each other. And, well, okay, that's that story. Anyway, it's an earlier draft, not all that differently comparable to the alternate drafts of Pebble in the Sky or End of Eternity that you would find in the alternate Asimovs. So it really belongs to that time period. That's when the story was published. So I handled both Day of the Hunters and Big Game in a single installment that goes back now quite a number of installments ago. So Big Game is already out there, but it didn't sell to Campbell as a probability zero. So the next thing he wrote is the one we're talking about now. I'm going to skip over that for just a brief moment. The third story he wrote for Campbell as a probability zero was Time Pussy, and that one, in fact, did get published back in the day. This is 1942. So we are looking at when Foundation, first Foundation story is about to be published, but this is already an issue or two earlier in the year 1942, so it would have been written either late 41 or early 42. And so indeed for this second of 3 stories written on that request, a little short story titled First Law. Now, First Law is a robot story, but as I've mentioned, it is not collected in iRobot, so it ends up in this other omnibus volume, what we called The Rest of the Robots. So it is gathered up in here, along with Victory Unintentional and Robot AL-76 Goes Astray, and several other robot stories simply written after the iRobot stories had all been collected, published, and gathered up together into iRobot. So that includes some pretty good classics like Galley Slave and Satisfaction Guaranteed and Risk and Galley Slave, Lenny, and then maybe 1 or 2 others. But at any rate, you got fully 8 robot short stories in there. Of course, that book is thick because it includes 2 other robot tales, namely the 2 Elijah Bailey stories, Caves of Steel and The Naked Sun, are all gathered into that one omnibus volume at a time when other omnibus volumes are being prepared. The 3 Galactic Era novels that was formed as Triangle, and of course the Foundation trilogy, and it's gathered into a single volume. But in paperback, they would just do the stories by themselves. So it's just stories from, really, the rest of the robots. So what is Risk? If it's not an iRobot type story, well, of the non-iRobot stories, it's kind of unusual, especially during the era where it could have been included if you'd been so inclined. It features one of our main characters, namely Mike Donovan. It does not feature Greg Powell. It does not feature Susan Calvin. But Mike Donovan is telling this story about a robot that, well, he says it didn't follow the first law. Maybe it kind of invented an extraordinary and unusual custom zeroth law of its own, in a manner of speaking, not to be confused with the zeroth laws developed by robot Daniel. Robot Daniel. But anyway, so this robot series has a letter that's M-A, and they made 3 of them, and apparently because of the letters M-A, they called them Emma, kind of a feminine name, okay, and they were just called Emma 1, 2, and 3, Emma 1, Emma 2, Emma 3. It's Emma 2 that particularly concerns us here because it kept wandering off with some mysterious project of its own until eventually they kind of lost track of it. And it turns out that Mike Donovan is claiming he got caught in a snowstorm, and this would be on Enceladus, one of the moons of Saturn. Okay, let's just say there's snowstorms there. Funny how we can try to estimate what's on these moons. He thought there'd be snow on Io. Comparison to what we found Io was really like. Enceladus, on the other hand, probably does not have snowstorms, but oh well, that's how it happens. But Emma number 2 had this project it was doing, and this ends up being another one of these stories where apparently you gather enough circuits and knowledge and programming and give it a name and a kind of a self-actuating functionality, and it kind of acquires a sentience, almost like a soul or whatever, of its own, an existence of itself as a sentient being. And this project involved the creation of yet another robot, sort of a clone of itself, a smaller, simpler, but clone of itself, which they called Emma Jr. or Emma 2 Jr. And here he is, he's stuck in the snowstorm. He needs Emma's guidance to get back to the station. Well, it turns out he didn't need it, but it seemed like he did, and yet Emma ran off to do this other thing that was more important, a first law above the robotic first law of the three laws of robotics, at least to Emma too. I won't give away what that is, although I practically have given enough clues. It's kind of silly. It's this perfect example, I think, of what I would think a probability zero should have been. Because remember, a probability zero is supposed to be you tell something that sounds outrageous and sounds crazy, but at the same time just might be feasible. You don't know. If you can believe that robots can become sentient beings just by having enough circuits and programming and data and so on and so forth, and having a name and being addressed as such by human beings, if you can accept that idea and that it could therefore gain sentience, and even to the point where it can basically make a copy of itself or at least another robot of some sort, even if smaller and simpler, that it might acquire certain other characteristics of intelligent, rational beings, and that might actually dick around with its laws of robotics. You still got the basic three; they're all there, but there's a new first law that even has higher priority, or maybe it knew enough weather to be able to say, it's okay, I can tell from the weather that's going to fade, and Mike Donovan will not be in any real danger. He'll find his way home. Meanwhile, I've got this other thing that is maybe at least as important to me, and he goes off to attend to this thing. So, anyway, that's first law, and it's kind of unusual to see one stay in the pipeline so ridiculously long, from 1941 or 2 clear to the October 1956 issue of Fantastic Universe. There are a few other stories that are kind of around for a long time, and we'll have one or two more that'll be like that. But we're kind of scraping the bottom of the barrel. Mostly now he writes a story, and either it gets published fairly soon or not at all. There might be an exception or two, but I think we're almost done with that. So, anyway, that's what there is on first law. Thanks for listening.